The plane ticket was snatched from the girl's hand and torn apart right before the eyes of hundreds of passengers. The airport manager smirked with blatant contempt. "A person like you dares to board this flight? A fake ticket? Or are you trying to pull some trick?" All eyes turned to her. No one spoke up in her defense. No one helped her. But instead of fear, the girl stared straight at the man who had humiliated her, a cold glint flashing in her eyes. The airport buzzed like a broken beehive, the loudspeaker announcements blaring in waves, mingling with the sound of suitcase wheels rolling across the glossy stone floor. The scent of coffee from the nearby Starbucks wafted through, blending with the expensive perfume of hurried passengers. Lina Carter stood amidst the crowd, holding her business class ticket, her high heels clicking rhythmically as she approached the check-in counter. Today, she wore an elegant beige trench coat, her black hair tied up neatly, her gaze sharp yet calm. She handed over her ticket along with her passport, offering a gentle but confident smile. The man across from her, Gordon Blake, a middle-aged check-in agent, took her documents with a slow, deliberate motion. He wore the airline's dark blue uniform, but his crooked tie and bloodshot eyes betrayed a long, stressful workday. He glanced at the ticket, then at her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe as if appraising an object. Without a word of explanation, he gripped the ticket between his hands and tore it apart. The sound of ripping paper rang out, dry and harsh, like a knife slicing through the air. Lina stood stunned, eyes wide, her hand still extended in midair, as if she hadn't yet processed what happened. 1 second ago, the ticket was her gateway to an important flight to London. 1 second later, it was nothing but fragments fluttering to the floor, then tossed unceremoniously into the trash bin by Gordon. The space around the check-in counter seemed to freeze. Whispers rippled through the line of passengers behind her like waves. An elderly woman with glasses muttered something under her breath, while a young man pulled out his phone to record, the flash glinting in the corner of Lina's eye. She took a deep breath, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What did you just do?" Gordon crossed his arms over his chest, his face cold and impassive, his thin lips pressed tight. "This ticket isn't valid." Lina frowned, her gaze locking onto him. "Not valid? I booked a business class ticket through the official system. The booking code matches my passport. What are you talking about?" He shrugged, his voice laced with mockery and a hint of disdain. "I've seen plenty of cases like you, thinking that just holding a ticket in your hand automatically entitles you to premium service. But not everyone qualifies." His words pierced her pride like a needle. Lina was no stranger to this kind of treatment, the judgmental stares, the dismissive tones. Since she was young, she'd grown used to being doubted because of her youthful appearance and unassuming style. But this time, the insult was too blatant. A quiet rage simmered in her chest, burning like molten lava. She clenched her fists, her nails digging painfully into her palms. "What are you implying?" Her voice remained calm, but it carried an invisible weight. Gordon smirked, a smug half-smile curling his lips. "Figure it out yourself." Then he turned to the next passenger, waving a hand as if Lina no longer existed. The whispers around her grew louder. A middle-aged woman murmured to her husband, "Probably faked the ticket to get into business class." A teenage boy snickered, raising his phone higher to capture her face clearly. But Lina wasn't the type to be easily bullied. She stood still, took a deep breath, and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen, dialing a familiar number. When the call connected, her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Dad, there's a little problem at the check-in counter of our airline." Gordon hadn't even had time to savor his sense of triumph when the internal phone on the counter rang, its shrill tone cutting through the noisy crowd. One of his colleagues, a young man with a freckled face, picked it up. Within seconds, his complexion paled, his eyes widening as if struck by lightning. He handed the receiver to Gordon, his voice trembling. "It's from the senior management office." Gordon raised an eyebrow but maintained his nonchalant demeanor. He picked up the phone, his tone confident. "This is Gordon. What's the matter?" A voice from the other end cut him off, sharp and icy like a blade. "You just tore up a ticket belonging to a passenger named Lina Carter, didn't you?" Gordon swallowed hard, a flicker of unease creeping into his chest. The name Carter rang in his mind like an alarm bell, but he tried to stay composed. Yes, but the ticket wasn't valid, so I... Silence. The curt command stopped him cold. A chill ran down his spine, sweat beading on his forehead despite the airport's full-blast air conditioning. Do you know who she is? The voice on the phone remained low, but carried an authority that brooked no defiance. She's the daughter of David Carter, the CEO of this airline, and you just tore her ticket in front of hundreds of passengers. Gordon's mind went blank. He glanced at Lina, now standing a few steps away with her arms crossed. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were as sharp as a blade, as if she'd known all along how this would unfold. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but his throat was too dry to speak. The voice continued, I want an official explanation from the airline. If I don't get a satisfactory answer within 5 minutes, this man will lose his job immediately. The line went dead. Gordon stood rooted to the spot, still clutching the receiver, the dial tone buzzing like the ticking of a time bomb. He looked around, realizing every staff member at the counter was watching him, their eyes a mix of curiosity and apprehension. A few passengers began talking loudly. Looks like he tore the wrong person's ticket. Snickers erupted from somewhere in the crowd. Lina stepped forward, holding her phone out in front of him. On the FaceTime screen was David Carter, his piercing blue eyes, silver-streaked hair, and an unmistakable aura of command. You have 30 seconds to explain why you thought you had the right to tear my daughter's ticket, he said, his voice deep like rolling thunder. Gordon stammered, I thought it was fake. The system didn't show the booking code. But he knew his excuse was flimsy to the point of absurdity. He hadn't checked thoroughly, acting instead on instinct and prejudice. Lina pulled the phone back, her gaze no longer angry but shifting to cold contempt. You should know that power doesn't come from standing behind a check-in counter, she said softly, yet loud enough for those nearby to hear. It comes from how you treat others. Just 10 minutes after that fateful call, a senior manager appeared at the check-in counter. He wore a sleek black suit, his expensive leather shoes clicking decisively on the marble floor. His face was as hard as tempered steel, his eyes glinting sternly behind silver-framed glasses. He didn't even glance at Gordon as he approached, his voice low but cutting. You're suspended from duty effective immediately. Go to the meeting room to deal with HR. Now. Gordon stood frozen, still clutching his cold coffee cup, his bloodshot eyes blinking rapidly as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. He looked around, catching the curious and pitying stares of his nearby colleagues. A young female staff member, whom Gordon had once berated for being slow, covered her mouth to stifle a giggle. The murmurs from the crowd of passengers grew louder, swelling like an uncontrollable tide. He's done for, a middle-aged man whispered to his wife, pointing at Gordon. Tore the ticket of the boss's daughter, talk about digging his own grave. He bowed his head, slowly gathering his belongings, a cheap ballpoint pen, a crumpled stack of notepaper, and the coffee cup that now seemed like evidence of his failure. Each step he took away from the counter felt heavy, as if the floor were pulling at his worn-out shoes. Hundreds of passengers' eyes followed him, some raising their phones to record the scene, flashes of light stabbing like tiny knives into his already shattered pride. Laughter, chatter, and the echoing loudspeaker announcements blended into a symphony of humiliation in the vast airport space. But that wasn't the end of it. When Gordon entered the meeting room, a small, secluded space behind the staff area, smelling of old wood and lit by flickering fluorescent lights, he hadn't expected the nightmare to continue. 3 HR representatives were already seated, 2 men and a woman, all in matching suits, their gazes cold like judges in an unofficial trial. On the table sat a thick stack of documents, next to a running recorder with a blinking red light like an unblinking eye. Sit down, Mr. Blake, the woman said, her voice even but heavy with authority. We've received a full report on the incident. You have 5 minutes to explain yourself before we make a final decision. Gordon sat, the plastic chair creaking dryly beneath him. Sweat poured under his shirt, his trembling hands resting on the table. I thought the ticket was invalid, he stammered, his voice hoarse. The system didn't show the booking code, and she didn't look like someone who usually flies business class. I was just following procedure. One of the men, with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as a blade, interrupted. Procedure? How many times did you check the system before tearing the ticket? Did you consult the shift manager? Or did you act on your own, based on personal bias? Gordon fell silent, his lips pressed tight. He knew he had no convincing answer. The truth was, he hadn't checked carefully, glancing at the computer screen only once before letting his arrogance take over. He'd always seen himself as the one in control at the check-in counter, deciding who boarded and who didn't. But now, that false power was crumbling before his eyes like a sandcastle swept away by the tide. The woman slid a sheet of paper toward him. This is your immediate suspension notice. Additionally, we'll consider termination if you can't provide a valid reason within 48 hours. You may leave. Gordon stared at the paper, the scrawled signature of the senior manager, like a death sentence. He wanted to shout, to slam the table in protest, but his legs felt frozen. He stood, stumbling out of the room, the world spinning around him. As the door closed behind him, a faint laugh from a staff member echoed down the hall. The final knife plunged into his bleeding heart. 3 days later, Lina received an email from HR. Gordon Blake wants to meet you. She was in her London office, the dim light from a gray sky filtering through the large glass window, reflecting off her ebony desk. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen, wondering why she should waste more time on someone who'd insulted her. But then her father's voice echoed in her mind. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about giving people a chance. She sighed and clicked accept. The meeting took place in another room, a cold space with the smell of old paint and the hum of a faulty air conditioner. Gordon sat across from her, no trace of his former arrogance. His wrinkled shirt clung to his gaunt frame, his eyes shadowed from 3 sleepless days, his hands clenched on the table until his knuckles whitened. I know I was wrong, he began, his voice raspy and nearly breaking. I'm not here to beg for my job. I just want to say, I truly regret it. I let my pride blind me, and now I'm paying the price. Lina crossed her arms, her eyes studying the harsh lines of his weathered face. So what are you going to do? She asked, her tone cool but not harsh. Gordon looked up, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. I've requested a transfer to customer support, to start over. He gave a bitter, self-deprecating smile. I think I need to relearn how to treat passengers properly. I was wrong to think I could judge people just because they stood in front of me. Lina stayed silent, her gaze sweeping over him, searching for any hint of deceit. But in that moment she saw a fragile sincerity, like a small flame struggling to burn through ashes. She wasn't sure she could fully trust him, but she sensed a change, however slight. I hope the next time I fly, it's on a flight where you're no longer the Gordon Blake from that day, she said. Her voice soft but firm, a final warning. He nodded, his eyes flickering with gratitude and shame. I hope so too, he whispered, bowing his head as if to hide a face warped by regret. A week later, Lina sat on her return flight from London, the business-class seat cradling her like a gentle embrace. Through the small window, she watched white, fluffy clouds drift lazily under a crimson sunset, like bloodstains spreading across the sky. She thought of Gordon, the chaos at the airport, and how a single moment could shatter a person or redeem them. The incident had spread across social media like wildfire. Hundreds of videos from witnessing passengers were posted, captioned with outrage. Arrogant airline staff tears CEO's daughter's ticket right at the counter. Some criticized Gordon, calling him a pompous fool finally taught a lesson by life. Others praised Lina's composure and handling of the situation. But all agreed it was a vivid tale of power, responsibility, and humility. As the plane landed at her home airport, Lina stepped out of the gate, the cool evening air filling her lungs. She pulled her small suitcase, her heels clicking steadily on the floor, her eyes scanning the bustling crowd. Suddenly, she paused, noticing a large billboard on the wall, the logo of her family's airline, with the words, "We're committed to serving you with respect." She smiled faintly, wondering if it was a coincidence or a subtle change her father had quietly made after the incident. But Gordon's story hadn't fully faded from her mind. A month later, back at the airport for another business trip, she overheard 2 staff members chatting at the coffee stand. "Blake's working in customer support now," one said, voice tinged with surprise. Yesterday I saw him helping an old lady with a lost luggage complaint, patient as can be. Nothing like the old him. Lina stood still, holding her hot coffee, the warmth seeping into her palms. She didn't know if Gordon had truly changed or was just playing a role to atone. But in that moment, she chose to believe people could fix their mistakes, not because they deserved it, but because sometimes a second chance was all they needed to rediscover themselves. She stepped out of the airport, the late-day sun glinting off her glossy black hair, casting a faint halo. Her phone buzzed, a message from her father lighting up the screen. The airline just fired another employee for mistreating a customer. See, justice never sleeps. Lina smiled, texting back, and sometimes it knows how to forgive. The story closed with Lina walking through the crowd, her figure gradually disappearing behind the airport's automatic glass doors. Somewhere in that vast building, Gordon might be bowing his head to another passenger, relearning the humility he'd long lost. His false power had collapsed entirely, but from those ashes, a new man might or might not be slowly rising.